Okay, so let me try to explain what I mean by the common, and then I'm hoping that that could resonate with something that you're thinking about Taksim and about the other struggles. In part, this thinking about the common starts with a recognition of crisis, a crisis in concepts. Often we're given just two choices, especially in the current crisis, that we can either have the state or the market. That in fact, the ills of the state, some say, will be cured by the medicine of private property. And then the others say, well, the ills of neoliberalism will be cured by the medicine of the state. And it seems like these are our only two choices. So a negative definition of the common would be that which is neither state nor market, neither public property nor private property. And by public, I mean something very restricted here. I'm just referring to that which is under the control and regulation of the state. In some sense, property, private property or public property, always means a limitation of access and a monopoly over decision-making. Property is always some sort of an enclosure. So the common, here's now attempted a positive definition, that the common is not property. The common instead is defined by shared open access and democratic collective self-management. I'll give you something more practical in a minute. Sorry to be so abstract. But one thing that's important to me from the beginning is that the common is not spontaneously organized, but rather implies institution, management, or regularized practices. I'm thinking of the common as both a material good and also the common as an immaterial good or a relationship, a social or cultural relation. Both are, in all of these respects, can be common. So in all these respects, you would define the common, whether thinking of as an idea as common, a physical space as common, electricity as common. It would be that we have equal open access to it and collective democratic self-management. I want to tell an anecdote. I was excited about going to the protests surrounding the 2009 climate summit in Copenhagen, because it seemed to me it brought together two streams of activists that were both thinking about the common, but in different ways. So on the one hand, I was thinking about an ecological common, one in which neither the state nor the market has shown itself adequate for regulating the earth and its ecosystems, managing collectively our access to it and use of them. And so here, thinking of the earth, the water, the forests, the atmosphere as limited goods, which we need to treat as common and manage together. It seemed to be one stream of activists that thought of that limited notion, the common, or the common as a limited earth. There was another stream of activists that were also focused on the common. I'm thinking of anti-capitalist movements that were focused on thinking of as common cultural products, code, ideas, information, music, which are all, in some sense, not unlimited, but reproducible and can be shared by all. So there's a different notion, also thinking about the common, but a common that had different qualities. There you go. And so the conceptual clash I saw was crystallized in the slogans. Like the anti-capitalist slogan that's been my favorite for the last 2 decades, which was also at the protest, was, "We want everything for everyone." But as you can imagine, from the environmentalist perspective, thinking of the common as limited, that sounds like mutually assured destruction. Like more stuff? We want everything for everyone? And one of the best slogans for the environmental groups at the protests during the legal march was, "There is no planet B," meaning that we're stuck with this earth. But you can imagine from the perspective of the anti-capitalist movements, this sounds like Margaret Thatcher saying there is no alternative. Because for the anti-capitalist movements, another world is always possible. And so I was struck by most streams of movements thinking about the common, but thinking about a common with different qualities. I had come to realize, though, that what's central to the common, this is maybe more my problem than their problem, that what's central to the common is not the object or even its qualities, whether the common is limited or reproducible, but rather the mode of organization or management. In other words, open access will be different for different objects, water or music, but what's central is the mode of democratic decision-making that manages that. So the common is thus not only, or even primarily, an economic issue about property, but really a political issue about democratic decision-making. So in this sense, contemporary social movements, yes, sure, are oriented towards material and immaterial forms of the common, but most important and essential seems to me their focus on the common as a form of organization. So fundamentally, what we share and to which we have open access is the political process itself. What we manage collectively is that political process. I think that's what Tony and I probably meant by the term multitude as a political project. And just to make this a little more concrete, I would read the structure or the experiments with general assemblies in many of the encampments since 2011 as an experiment in making common the political process. In other words, giving open and equal access and having collective self-management of the political processes, of the decision-making. I should add that all of you who have been involved in general assemblies or any other such experiments know how terribly fucked up they are. But that, I think, doesn't, at least it doesn't for me, negate the aspiration and the attempts at the construction of an open political process. At this point, I had prepared examples about struggles over water and making water common against the privatization of water, for instance, in Bolivia in 2000, a referendum in Italy 2 years ago. And that had many interesting characteristics. What would interest me more is to hear from you about electricity and what it would mean to make electricity common, and what would be the process and what would be the end result. What are we aiming for? I just want to point out two things that I found useful from the water struggles. The first is that in both of these struggles, the insistence was that the water is common. They were anti-privatization struggles, saying that the water is ours and we need to manage it. In both cases, Italy and Bolivia, the result was a reinstatement of the control of the state. And so, in a way, what was aimed for was the common. What ended up was the public, which is not terrible. It may be better than privatization, but it leads to a certain kind of frustration because if what we wanted was collective self-management, that's not, at least in the Italian and Bolivian cases, what the result was. The second aspect that I found interesting in these two examples about water, which makes me curious about the electricity example, is that in both cases, I think, was underestimated the apparatuses required for the making common of water. In other words, to declare water common is one thing, but then to control the entire physical structure and decision-making process is something very different. In the Bolivian case, finally, one thing that's interested me is that even after a new government was elected that claims to represent the movements that had been struggling for the common, the movements have, since its election, continued to struggle against the government that claims to represent it in a new cycle, in a way, of movements for the common and against the public. So in some ways, it has shifted. Maybe it's a beneficial shift from against neoliberal privatization for the common, and then to a struggle that's now against state control, which has, in some ways, many in the movements feel usurp their powers, and continuing to struggle against those that claim to represent them. So far, I've tried to give you an idea of what I might mean by saying that a demand for the right to the common is something that runs throughout the cycle of struggles. And then I've also tried to explain in some terms what I mean by the common. It would be a next process of such a discussion, which I won't go into, to discuss on the basis of such a right, what kind of constituent process could make it spread socially and be lasting. And I guess I should emphasize that when I say constituent process, I don't mean process to unify or homogenize, but rather to make the heterogeneous social relationships that are part of the struggle lasting. One little anecdote before concluding. Just one more explanation about that constitutional notion. A very good friend of mine who teaches constitutional law read my and Tony's pamphlet, and he said very nice things about it, but he said, I have to tell you that people who study U.S. constitutional law will have no idea what you mean by constitution. And I take that actually as a compliment. I guess I just say that to let you know that I understand that there when I say constituent process here, there's much explaining that has to be. So let me just conclude in a way that I hope could open it up for some of the things that I would find interesting. What I've been trying to do is to think about, from the perspective of Taksim, from Gezi Park, to read the entire cycle is oriented towards proclaiming a right to the common. And a second coordinated element of this that maybe moves instead from Tahrir or even from Madrid to Istanbul is to move from the common to democracy. As I said earlier, one of the things that I found novel and inspiring about this cycle of struggle starting in 2011 was relaunching the question of democracy, not only against tyranny, but also against the so-called democratic systems. One brief anecdote about the indignados. In the encampments in Madrid and Barcelona, like in all of the others of this whole cycle of 2011, very few of the activists were veterans. A lot of people were newly politicized and new to politics. And in Madrid, there was an insistence that, from the beginning, that a primary slogan should be Democracia Real Ya, like real democracy now. And the veteran activists, of course, were embarrassed about the naivete. I mean, any good leftist, by which I mean cynical, can't use the term democracy anymore. But I think that because of the possibility opened by the Tunisian and Egyptian insurrections and the watchword of democracy for them, it made possible a rethinking of democracy among the young activists in Spain. And I think when I say naivete, I mean it with all of the, as a praiseworthy element. And so from that perspective, I'm wondering what it would mean in Istanbul today to express the struggle in terms of democracy. What would the demand for real democracy now mean in Istanbul? Okay, so in all of this, I'm saying that the declaration of a right or the declaration of a truth is extremely important, but it's not enough. And what would be needed is another step, which would be needed is a constituent process to make the movements last in each locale